So now to our next speaker, who's Doris Tsao. Doris was born in China and moved to US together with her family as a child. Doris now works as a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, US. Doris has her own lab, and they are searching to uncover secrets in the brain. She receives the Kavli Prize for the discovery of a specialized system within the brain to recognize faces. And Doris, please tell me, have I got it right? Where I recognize faces, this is it? Yes, please come on stage. So remember, here.
Good morning. I'm so happy to have the chance to talk to you. Oh, where's my... Oops. So I'm a visual neuroscientist, and what this means is that I study how the brain processes visual information. So light hits your two eyes, and it forms an image. And then that image gets sent to your brain through electrical signals. And then within your brain, you have many different areas that are processing different aspects of this image. And somehow, all these neurons that are communicating to each other through these electrical signals are able to make sense of these pixels and stitch them together into objects and assign meaning to them and figure out the spatial relations between them and build this conscious perception of objects in a 3D space. And it's really a miracle, and that's what I'm trying to understand. So this endeavor to understand visual perception lies at the intersection of several different fields: biology, psychology, math, and also this newly emerging field of artificial intelligence. It also gets at one of the most profound mysteries of existence, which is the mind-body problem. So, Descartes first posed this, right? How does res extensa, or extended substance, become res cogitans, or thinking substance? How can neurons in this physical world generate this private, subjective world? So, in my lab, we pursue these questions in macaque monkeys, whose brains are remarkably similar to ours. And we've done a lot of work on this set of 6 regions called face patches. And these regions turn out to respond much more to faces than to any other object. And you can think of these 6 patches as the brain's carpenter shop for generating your conscious perception of a face. So earlier, I mentioned that the neurons in the brain communicate through electrical signals. And so as a neuroscientist, we want to understand what these signals mean, right? We want to understand the neural code. And it's sort of like trying to read hieroglyphics. And so the way we go about this is that we make various hypotheses or guesses about what the spikes mean. In the case of the space patch system, we guess how specific pattern spikes translate to specific features of a face, and then we test our hypothesis. And so one of our major discoveries was figuring out the code that the cells in these space patches use to represent your facial identity. So here you can see 3 faces that we showed to a monkey, and while the monkey was looking at these different faces, we were recording from neurons in these face patches. And because we understood the code of these neurons, we could actually reconstruct these faces just by listening to the electrical activity of the neurons. And this is a reconstruction from just 200 neurons. So, people often say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I would add, or 200 neurons. So, how did I get here? When I was a kid, I was not interested in science at all, but I really loved to read, and I especially loved to read biographies. So that was my first notion of a scientist, and it seemed like a really heroic, romantic life, worth having a biography written about. And also, it seemed accessible to me, right? As opposed to becoming a court composer or the wife of a famous politician. But as a kid, I had no idea what science actually was, right? So science, to me, is this joy in understanding the universe beneath the surface. And I was not a curious child. I didn't, obsess about dinosaurs or Star Trek or anything science-related. I actually played with Barbie dolls. So I remember very clearly the very first time I actually had a question about the world that bothered me. I think I was in 5th or 6th grade, and I woke up one morning, and I wondered, is space infinite or not? And if space was infinite, that just seemed incredible, that infinity could actually exist. And if it weren't infinite, and it was just a giant room surrounded by a wall, then wouldn't the wall also be occupying space? And so I really tied myself up in knots for, I thought about this for like a week. And it really bothered me. And I remember that feeling of excitement and wonder and also terror. And now that I've been a scientist for many years, I realize that's it doesn't get better than that feeling. Right? So in high school, I spent a summer digging into Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And in this book, Kant proposes that space and time are actually, he calls them pure intuitions, right? They're like the glasses through which you perceive everything, and you can never take them off. And this was a mind-blowing concept to me, right? Suddenly, I realized the answer to that question that had bothered me when I was a kid about whether space is infinite or not. Actually, the answer wasn't out there. It was in here. And we need to understand how our brain actually creates this concept of space. So after I got accepted to Caltech for college, I picked up the Feynman lectures. Richard Feynman was a famous Caltech professor, and I read volume 1. And this was really the book that initiated me into science. Right? So I think David talked about how the curriculum often in school is very dry, right? I think he said you solve these problems with frictionless pulleys, and it's really not clear why that's interesting. It certainly wasn't interesting to me, and science was really the last thing that I wanted to do with my life. But the Feynman lectures are just another world, right? Like chapter 1, he talks about the ancient Greeks and the atomic theory and how they viewed the world. He has a chapter where he explicates how a glass of wine contains the universe. He has 2 chapters about the physics of vision. He goes everywhere. It's really another way of viewing the universe. And he also introduces this way of thinking where there's a hard problem, and you try to change your reference frame to make the problem easier. And I found that just such a beautiful way of thinking. So this really, I understood what science was for the first time after I read this book. And what's amazing is that I've met many scientists since then who've had the exact same experience. Right? This was the book that made them realize what science is. So I really recommend this book. Okay. So my father is a mathematician, and my mother was a computer programmer, and my father has had a huge influence on my life. So he's the person who made me realize that this problem of vision is mathematically profound and beautiful. And also, he's probably my most important role model in science. So, after he got his PhD, he was completely self-made. He didn't really have a job. Like my mom, financially supported the family, and he was just pursuing his own curiosity. Not for any external glory. He didn't have any academic position, but just because that was what's exciting, right? And he's 80 now, and I think he works harder than I do. And I should say, 2 years ago, we actually wrote a paper together about a new theory of vision that I'm very excited about, and we're actually testing this in my lab now. So besides my father, my most influential teacher was my PhD advisor, Marge Livingstone. She is an extraordinary scientist, does all her own experiments, analyzes her own data. And one very important lesson she taught me was the importance of thinking about a problem on your own and not worrying too much about what people had thought about before. And so one memorable example of this was when she came into lab one day and she declared that she had figured out the secret of the Mona Lisa. And we were all kind of incredulous, but then she explained her theory to us and why it is that, when you look at her smile, it disappears, and when you look away, it reappears. And it was obvious that she got it. And people have actually, been able to recreate that mysterious smile in other faces using this principle. And what was amazing was that, the Mona Lisa's been around for 500 years. There's probably, been books written about her smile. And Marge didn't worry about any of that. She just thought about it from first principles and figured it out. Okay, I was asked to give some words of wisdom, so I thought, what would I tell my 2 boys who are 7 years old now when they grow a little bit older? And here's what I would say. Curiosity and passion matter much more than everything else. So, in life, you're going to meet constantly people who are smarter than you, just more knowledgeable than you, more capable than you in any number of dimensions, right? And this has certainly happened to me this week, meeting the other laureates. But ultimately, that doesn't matter, right? It's really your own curiosity and passion that matters. Life is not a competition with others. You just need to improve yourself each day. And this is something I have to remind myself. When you feel most alone and strange, when your deepest desires feel out of sync with the world, that's the most precious moment when you're asserting your own vision. Right? So when you have a new idea, just by the fact that it's a new idea, you're going to feel lonely and strange and uncertain, and you just have to embrace that. You will know what you love. That's something given. The challenge is how to achieve it. So I remember, when I was your age, I asked my dad, when I grow up, how am I going to know what to do? And this is what he told me. You're going to know what you love. The challenge of life is to figure out how to get it. And at least in my case, that's really been true. And David Hubel, my mentor and hero, he used to say, you don't have to be like everyone else. And I like to hear that. So after I wrote all this down, I realized that they're actually all saying the same thing. Right? They're really saying, follow your own inner vision. So I think that's the best advice I have to give. If life is like an apple tree, then I think you guys are at the stage where you're trying to find that seed, right? The thing that's worth devoting your whole life to. And I really think that is the most important thing. You have to get that right. And in my case, I think that seed was really planted, that morning when I wondered whether space is infinite or not. That put me on this path to discover Kant, and it was really foreordained that I would become a visual neuroscientist. And your path will be different, but really, when you have that experience where you feel just there's something speaking inside, it could just be a little question. You should really, be open to that and listen to it. I love this book by Peter Medawar, Advice to a Young Scientist. So he writes in a very funny British way. And he gives advice that's obvious but also true. So he says if you want to be a great scientist, you have to study an important problem that other people care about. You also have to solve this problem. And so the art of science is finding the soft underbelly into hard problems. And in my case, it was realizing that this face patch system, which at first glance may seem to just let us study this relatively narrow question of how do you see a face, actually opens the door to much bigger, more profound questions about how the brain generates consciousness and how it represents the world at large. Okay, finally, if I could talk to my 15-year-old self, what would I tell her? So, when I was 15, I was very, very worried, stressed about all kinds of things, as many of you, I'm sure, are, right? The biggest source of stress was probably, will I get into Caltech? And so I would tell her, you will get into Caltech, you'll even become a professor there someday, and in due time you'll meet your soulmate and build a family, so you don't have to worry about that. Of course, if I didn't worry about that, probably none of those things would happen. But really, the most important thing I would tell my 15-year-old self was something that my father actually told me every day, and he told me with such conviction that I wanted to prove him right. So you're special, and you will change the world. So, yeah, I think that's just an axiom, and if you believe that, then if you really believe that, everything else will take care of itself. So,
Thank you so much. And
Yes.
This book is around here too, in Norwegian.
That's amazing. Yeah, this is the actual book I read like when I was like 10 years old or something in English.
In English, yeah. Oh, actually, you sort of grew up in a library, didn't you?
I did, yes.
They were babysitting for you, really. So, time for questions, people. Who wants to start?
How would these face patches look for people who are unable to recognize faces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are these people who have prosopagnosia, and like some of them, they become unable to recognize faces because they have a stroke in one of these regions, right? So blood vessel ruptures, and so the region gets destroyed. There's also about 5% of the population, or 4% of the population, they actually just can't recognize faces. They don't have a stroke. And when you go do fMRI in these people, you find that often they're missing one or more of these face areas.
I see another hand here, but the microphone's over there. Gentleman with the white shirt, yeah.
When you imagine faces or objects in your mind, is that the same? Can you read that the same way you would read if I just saw it with my eyes?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work on that. It's very hard to ask a monkey to imagine a face. But we've had the opportunity to study human patients who have electrodes implanted in the brain for the purpose of finding the source of an epileptic seizure. And sometimes these electrodes actually end up in a face area, and so you can exactly do that and ask them to imagine faces. And we find that actually, yes, the cells activate, and they actually activate using the same code, right? So if you ask them to imagine one of those faces I just showed you, like that pattern of neurons will actually activate. And this is evidence for this idea that the brain has a generative model that's going backwards, and lets you recreate stimuli from very high-level thoughts, like just the name of a person.
Yeah. Is that a follow-up question? Okay.
Some people have the condition known as aphantasia, where they can't imagine things, but they can still see. So how would that How does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm very curious about those people. I don't know. I wonder if those people still dream. I suspect that they still have the basic architecture. So I don't know. Aphantasia also mystifies me. Like, why are these people unable to imagine? Yeah, I don't know.
I have heard a question, and it interests me a lot. Do you think everybody sees the same colors? For example, is your red my green, for example, or is my orange your purple? Do you have any thoughts on that, or an answer, or?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question. I don't think everyone sees it the same way. There's this phenomenon called synesthesia, where you can actually hear colors, right? So like the pianist Hélène Grimaud, like different notes, she actually sees them in color. And so I imagine her perception of color and sound is different from mine. But I think by and large, neuroscientists assume that everything that happens in this mental world, your perceptions of colors and thoughts and emotions, they have a basis in the brain, right? And so if we ask how do different animals, how do different people represent these different colors, then you can see that everyone, the same things happen, right? Like the mechanisms are exactly the same. And so from this hypothesis that everything in the mind is due to the brain, we would then infer that your percepts are also the same.
We have another question here.
How do you think your findings on facial recognition can contribute to the development of artificial intelligence, particularly in the areas of computer vision and deep learning?
Yeah, wonderful. The brain is so much more efficient than these current AI systems, right? DALL-E, like to make an image, apparently takes the same amount of power as to like charge up your cell phone, right? And we're making images constantly, like we're running on 30 watts. So how is this incredibly efficient biological intelligence possible? And the brain is doing this, so we think that if we understand its algorithm for generating images, when you imagine someone, it's going to be a much more efficient one. And so yeah, we're trying to understand that.
How does these spots react, differing on what kind of animal face they're looking at? For example, is there any difference when a monkey looks at a human or a fellow monkey?
Yes, these, it turns out that the code that these cells are using is a quite abstract code. We call it a shape appearance model. So it's keeping track of where all the key landmarks of the face are, and also the texture map. And so it can generalize across human faces, monkey faces, even cartoon faces, right? These cells in these patches actually respond very strongly to just a simple cartoon or even an emoji. And so the basic principles are the same for all of these different types of faces. Yeah.
Is there any particular reason for the patches to be separate instead of being one big patch?
Yes, that's a great question. So it turns out there's a deep reason for that. And the reason is that comes from what's surrounding each patch. It turns out that each patch is surrounded by neighboring patches that are doing the exact same thing, but they're coding other parts of a larger object space. And you have multiple representations of this object space in IT, and that's why they're separated.
Yeah, I was just wondering how you would go about trying to interpret this code or these signals in the brain.
Yeah, the basic approach is that you have to have a hypothesis, right? So you measure these signals, you show some faces, and you build a model, right? And your model could be wrong. And so how do we know if the model is right or wrong? Well, we show new stimuli, okay? And we built this model, and then we test them on the new stimuli. So we have a prediction for this entirely new face, how the cells are going to respond based on our model. And if it matches how they actually respond, then we're happy. And if it doesn't, then we go back to the drawing board and build a new model.
Any other questions? Last question? Doris,
right.
I would definitely remember your face forever and ever.
Oh.
Yeah, and thanks for giving us such a wonderful speech.
Thank you.
Thank you.